Welcome to a special broadcast. My name is Anthony Martinez. Today we are joined by the legendary journalist Dan Rather. As the first journalist to break the news of President Kennedy's death to instilling common confidence in the wake of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, Dan Rather has covered every major news story of our time. Dan Rather has covered every presidential campaign since 1952 and has interviewed every president since Harry Truman. He was the White House correspondent for CBS News during the administrations of President Johnson and Nixon, and was a leading force in the broadcast news investigation of the Watergate scandal. During the 1960s, as the chief of CBS Southwest Bureau, Rather reported from the flashpoints on the civil rights struggle in the South. Rather retired as the anchorman and managing editor of the CBS Evening News in 2005 after 24 years at the news desk. Rather's latest venture is the Hard Edge news show Dan Rather Reports, broadcasted on HDNet, on which he acts as both the host and the managing editor. With his renowned in-depth interviews and love of investigative reporting, Rather is able to accurately report on the major issues facing our nation today, from politics and the global economy to international affairs and the environment. He gives each story the time and commitment that it deserves. Today, Dan Rather will join us to discuss his legacy, the current state of journalism, and the current political climate. Mr. Rather, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's begin with recent events. In Arizona, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords shooting rampage. Much of the news afterwards was about the political climate that's in America right now. After the Kennedy assassination, you noted that it was attributed to the political climate in Dallas among conservatives.
Right.
What do you think that journalists can do, politicians can do, and Americans as a whole can do to prevent a heinous act like this from happening again?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that there is no guarantee that this kind of act won't happen again. In fact, the odds are very strong that it will happen again. But I think what we can do is follow President Obama's lead when he called for, this is obviously not a direct quote, that we need to sort of take a deep breath, pause, think about how lucky we are to be in this country, and to understand that we can differ, we can have our differences, but they're best expressed and the national debate is best carried on in an atmosphere of civility and mutual respect. I think that's the best we can do. We have gone through these things before, as you mentioned, the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassination of the late great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., assassination of Bobby Kennedy, attempts on former Alabama Governor, the late George Wallace. We've gone through these things. And it is true that after Dallas, it was said that the political climate there, probably, a very important word, probably contributed. But given the facts as best we know them about these assassinations carried out by loners, people who had some kind of mental difficulty and or narcissistic desire to gain respect and notoriety, we know there's no way to prevent them, but we also know that there are ways to keep the climate where we keep these kinds of things to an absolute minimum.
And going on, Congressman Giffords, immediately after the shooting, NPR reported incorrectly that she had died. And you were quoted in an AP article as saying that if you were covering the story in the 1970s and the 1980s, you would not likely have gone with the NPR report, as many other news organizations did.
Right.
However, you said if you were in the anchor chair in 2011, you probably would have. Why?
Well, because the pressure would have been tremendous, no excuses. The pressure would have been tremendous to go. The media climate has changed so dramatically and so swiftly in the last few years. And the pressure is on if somebody, particularly someone as well respected as NPR, reports something. Two things come into play. One is the competitive pressure. Again, no excuse. I'm trying to explain what happens. One is the competitive pressure. And the other is the tremendous cut in resources that the CBS News or NBC News or ABC News of 1970, 1980 had many more resources than they have today. Now another contributing, so if that's a contributing factor, you don't have as many people to check. Another contributing factor is the size of the media competitive arena has expanded so greatly with cable television, satellite television, now internet, computers, cell phones, all of this, that once something gets out, it contributes to the pressure of, listen, everybody else, quote, everybody else is carrying it, so the pressure doesn't carry it. I was trying to be honest with the AP guy, that if, I know in the 1970s, 1980s, somebody said, listen, NPR didn't exist then, but NPR is reporting this and such. You say, well, okay, but we need to confirm it ourselves. Today, the front office will call the newsroom and say, NPR has carried this, and furthermore, AP is carrying it, and 8 other people are carrying it. I think in this particular case, AP didn't. But everybody else is carrying this. Why don't we have it on the air? And that's the way it works.
And you talked about the lack of resources. When you were covering the Vietnam War for Walter Cronkite, it's completely different than today covering the war. War coverage has vastly changed. Can you discuss why it's changed, and is it for the better or for the worse?
Well, I think it's not for the better. And we could spend the rest of this program and the next several days discussing all the reasons. But among the reasons is that at the time of the Vietnam War, keep in mind that there was no such thing as instant coverage. There was no live coverage of the war. There's no way to cover it live. We were shooting film and not videotape. The film had to be shipped somewhere. The film had to be processed. Mm-hmm. So a really fast coverage out of Vietnam would be a day and a half, and usually what you saw was 3 or 4 days. It happened 3 or 4 days ahead of time. Now there's a deadline every nanosecond, and that again, once again, I'm not the vice president in charge of excuses, but when you have a deadline every nanosecond and the ability to get up live from anywhere on the planet, Iraq, Afghanistan, where have you, it just creates pressures all around, and unfortunately, journalism, including this journalist, we succumb to those pressures. I'm not proud of it. I think we have a lot to answer for, but that's the way it is.
Right. And on that note, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Much more with Dan Rather when we return.